Welcome to the Behind Beliefs and Behaviors podcast, where we take you on a journey of what is behind the specific beliefs and behaviors that impact individuals and organizations. With our guests, we get to the root cause of what stands in the way of everything from health, wealth, and relationships to leadership, community transformation, and societal progress. From topics on leadership, psychological safety, corporate culture and communication, to parenting, trauma, relationships, personal health, and intimacy, this podcast is sure to get you to the source and provide you practical tips to transform your life one root cause at a time. I am your host, Dr. Maisha Claiborne. I'm a physician, a coach, a consultant, and an expert in trauma-informed communication. The founder of the Mind Remapping Company, I help individuals and organizations better understand the brain, behavior, and the root of false beliefs so that you can more effectively listen, communicate, connect, and create fulfilling relationships and results in your personal and professional life. Join us every Monday morning at 8 a.m. and let's get to the root cause and discover what's behind your beliefs and behaviors. Welcome back to another episode. I am so excited to be having this conversation today. We are talking about uncompromising intimacy with Dr. Alexandra Stockwell. And I'm very excited because relationships and intimacy are so important to me, and I think that they are the foundation. And you all know what I do. I'm all about communication and creating safety. And relationships are at the foundation of that. And so I'm just very excited to introduce Dr. Alexandra Stockwell of Alexandra Stockwell, MD Coaching and Consulting. She is a relationship and intimacy coach and intimate marriage expert. And I am looking forward. She's an author, by the way. She is an author, and her book is called Uncompromising Intimacy. We're going to talk a little bit more about that, but I'm honored to have her on the show today. Welcome, Dr. Alexandra. How are you today?
I'm wonderful, and I feel really honored to be a part of the birthing of this new podcast. I think, what underlies our thoughts and beliefs, if we're not looking at that, it doesn't matter what we're looking at. So I just think it's so great.
Yes, absolutely. Well, I always like for my listeners to get to know my guests. So would you just tell us a little bit about yourself? Like how did you get to this point? How did you become the intimacy doctor?
Okay. The way you asked that, it makes me wonder how far back I should go. But maybe I'll say I majored in philosophy and math in college and then went to medical school where I met my husband. We've been married for 28 years and have 4 children. And so we went through training together. He still practices medicine, and it was kind of a while ago now. You, of course, know there's a big phenomenon of physician burnout and physicians stepping away from medical practice. But when I wasn't burned out. It's not like I couldn't continue. I always loved practicing medicine. It was more at the level of a whisper that I felt like I had worked so hard. I had all these goals and dreams, and they basically all came true. I was in my mid-30s, and I didn't feel that sense of satisfaction that I had anticipated feeling once I got to where I was.
Right.
So I wasn't depressed. I wasn't dysfunctional. Like, I really enjoyed my life, but I thought, I don't see continuing to live this way for another 40 years.
Yeah.
And so I didn't know anyone who had stepped away from medicine voluntarily. It was only due to accident, injury, illness. And so I arranged a sabbatical, which was totally radical, just because no one had done it. And honestly, it felt sort of shameful to, like, it's a privilege to have people teach me how to practice medicine and learn to do it. But
Mhm.
anyway, I took a sabbatical, and honestly, my main focus during that time was, for the first time in my adult life, to do things because I felt like it,
Yeah. Oh,
as opposed to doing things in order to progress in some area of my life.
mhm,
And just this, essentially looking at what my motivation was and
mhm,
allowing it to be a more pure desire. I took a painting class. I spent time sitting by a river, just like being there.
yeah.
And one thing led to another, and I never actually returned to clinical medicine.
Mm,
I did a few different consulting things, but
mhm,
mostly I began exploring, and I felt like I found the switch to turn the light on
mm.
in so much of my life, doing the kind of work, my version of what you do, different personal growth trainings and different
Yeah.
things, to be able to pivot my mindset.
Mhm,
And it surprised me that as my emotions, my thoughts evolved, that my intimacy and the way my husband and I touched one another in the bedroom didn't evolve along with all the other evolution inside me and around me, in terms of my parenting and in terms of being calm and, you know, all that sort of thing.
yeah.
And so that caught my attention. What is it that's different
Mhm,
about having ease and awareness and open heartedness and vulnerability in the intimate context? And eventually, I did a very in depth training for personal reasons for myself and my
mhm,
marriage. But this personal training doubled as a coach training. And at the time,
mhm.
I really didn't know what a coach was, but I was very interested in pedagogical models. And
Yes.
so I went to the teaching lab, like, how do people learn to be able to help people in this arena? And as soon as I went to that first teaching lab, I just thought, oh, I have come home. What I went into medicine to do, this is really the vehicle through which
Mm,
I want to serve going forward.
yeah. I love that. It's so interesting. I smiled, when you talked about when it's like you had that aha moment and it felt so familiar. It felt
Mm,
so familiar. I remember, having a similar moment just around what I do and that coming home.
yes, yes.
And oftentimes, I think in our industry, we're taught to be a certain way. And
And to
I
override our feelings in order to be successful.
absolutely, and to not be vulnerable,
Yes.
right? And so I love that you cultivated a sabbatical that, in essence, what it sounds like led you to yourself, like your core self and what you love and what you're called to and what you're good at.
Yes, I have complete conviction about that now, but while I was going through it, I couldn't have said that. I really felt a lot more like I was gently bushwhacking through some new terrain. It was very confronting, and I didn't have the sense of purpose which then emerged. And I do, just in case this particular move inspires anyone, I didn't come to relationship and intimacy coaching during that year. It's more that during that year, I opened up the relationship with myself. It became more
Mhm.
important than it had been before. And I began a journey, and it was a number of years still before I really felt rooted again in terms of a professional context. And so
Mm,
that can be very unnerving, those years without rootedness, like lots of confidence, but no rootedness
yeah.
in terms of purpose. And so I just don't want to make it seem that it's so easy to just, step
Oh, yeah.
away, but it's so worth it.
Yeah. Yeah, there are a lot of in between experiences when you choose to step away from your chosen or trained profession. Absolutely. One of the things that I heard in in what you were saying, and of course, correct me if I heard differently, is that there's an intimacy that you cultivated within yourself that
Absolutely. That's a
Yeah.
very attuned response. And I think that's really essential, whether we're talking about pleasure or intimacy.
Mhm.
We need to be able to source that ourselves in
Mhm.
order to be able to share that with somebody else.
Yeah. Well, I want to talk about this word intimacy because I think that, you know, it gets a multiple wraps. People don't actually exactly know what it is. There's sometimes some shame around it. There's sometimes some fear around it. So I really would love to talk about this word intimacy and all the beliefs and things that come up around intimacy and what you've seen in your coaching. And of course, I'll share. I'm always transparent about my experiences, and so I'd love for you to start there.
Yeah, it's a really beautiful and important question because I think intimacy means really different things to different people. So there are certain people who hear the word intimacy and they think it's just code for sex, that it's a more permitted, more permissible, more sanitized term, but I'm
Mhm,
really just talking about sex. In
mhm,
fact, I was preparing to give a lecture once and going through it, and the wife of the person who was coaching me came in and said, I really don't think you should just be talking about sex. And it never occurred to me I was just talking about sex because that's not how I mean, it can certainly include intimacy, but it doesn't need to.
mhm,
Then there are people who hear the word intimacy and think, oh, it's all about feeling safe and it's all emotional. And it can be,
mhm,
but you don't want to just keep it there if we're talking about your love relationship.
mhm,
You want to be able to bring it into the physical too, whatever that means. I mean, that can mean explicitly sex, but it also can mean like you want your bodies, your whole self to participate in the intimacy. That's a better way to say what I'm saying.
yeah.
And the other thing is that a more like new age definition that many people respond to is into me you see.
Oh,
But I
yeah.
don't like that at all. And the reason I don't like it is it puts the onus on the person doing the seeing.
Mhm,
And I think of intimacy really as the act or the state of being of revealing oneself.
mm,
And so, if we want more intimacy, we have to be more willing to reveal who we are
mm,
and to be seen. And so, sure, it's connected with Into Me You See, but it's not because you're such a fantastic seer. It's because I know myself well enough to have the courage to authentically share. And with
mhm,
that, there's more and more intimacy available the
mhm,
more I get to know myself. And that sharing can be with a meaningful look, it can
mhm,
be with sharing about something that I feel fantastic about or something that I feel terrible about. And it certainly can be sharing with my clothes off, both
mhm.
literally and also metaphorically speaking.
Yeah. Let's talk about, because this is what immediately came to mind when you talk about revealing
Mm.
oneself. Let's talk about vulnerability because I know because I have experienced, and like even culturally speaking, this word being vulnerable and intimacy and its relationship to vulnerability comes up. And I can say, in the household in which I grew up, this word intimacy, we didn't speak this word, right? I didn't learn this word, what it really meant until much later in my life, within the last maybe 10 to 15 years. And I'm about to be 50. So that ought to tell you something. Right?
Well, I also think that's a trend in our culture. I certainly didn't learn any of I'm 55 and I didn't learn any of this at home. I
Mhm.
didn't discuss sex with my mother until I'd had two children, and I didn't learn any of this at home. But I do just want to say that I've been using the word intimate, and it used to be kind of wasn't sure if it'd be okay to say in
Mhm.
certain contexts, but it's just in the same way Brene Brown brought the word vulnerability into our
Yeah.
culture. The word
Mhm.
intimacy is it's growing in the culture. Like we're
Yeah.
all more aware of it. But please continue. You're like riding that cultural trend.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And I've come to learn, and this is one of the reasons I love podcasting, because I get to have these kinds of conversations, and they're as beneficial to me as they are to to the audience listening. But I come to know that in a lot of things, and a lot of things that I've experienced, that I wasn't alone, and I'm not alone. And that actually is very useful. And so in terms of the vulnerability, there's a lot of internal physiological experience that comes with that. And we can label it as trepidation or fear, or we can label it with whatever we label it with. But I know for myself growing up, being vulnerable was not a good thing. And somehow intimacy gets connected to vulnerability. And if you have trauma in your background, if you've witnessed, whether the trauma is like direct experience or whether it's vicarious,
Yeah,
that piece gets in the way of wanting to reveal oneself.
of course. Like, let's just say, of course. And I'd like to layer one more piece into the conversation,
Mhm.
which is to talk about uncompromising intimacy by way of saying that throughout the Western world, maybe the whole world, the most common relationship advice that's given is that if you want to be happy, you need to compromise. If you want to have a good marriage, you have to be really good at compromise.
Mm.
And that's just completely wrong because if what you want is a kind of bland, neutral, conflict free, pleasant companionship, then compromise will definitely get you there. But if what you want is intimacy and passion and a kind of magnificent collaborative connection and closeness and a kind of gratification and nourishment to all of you,
Mhm.
then uncompromising intimacy is the way to get there. And
Mhm.
by uncompromising, I do not mean that you always get your own way, you become
Mhm.
rigid and inflexible, not at all. But whereas compromise is withholding internal truth, your
Mhm.
desires,
Mhm.
your trauma, this is where I'm tying it into what you
Mhm.
asked about that when you're not able or willing, you don't know how
Mhm.
to share and you withhold what's true for you so that your partner is more comfortable. Like that's
Mhm.
how I define compromise. Keep things
Yeah.
conflict free so you don't make your partner uncomfortable.
Mhm.
In contrast, uncompromising intimacy is about learning how to reveal yourself, reveal what's true for you in a
Mhm.
way that your partner can hear it and ideally do the same. So
Mhm.
that's the context in which I want to answer your question
Mhm.
about vulnerability and whether it's a trauma response or habitual conditioning from childhood. Of course, for any individual, it makes a big difference which it is.
Mhm.
But in terms of the behavior, they can be kind of equivalent because it's a kind of being closed off.
Mhm.
If something hurts during sex, just not saying anything because you don't want to offend and ruin the
Mhm.
moment.
Mhm.
If what you'd like is a hug, but you don't want to ask and you don't happen to be married to a mind reader,
Mhm.
or
Mhm.
maybe you feel sad, but crying can feel dangerous and you
Mhm.
have to be in a good mood, or the way you know to connect is through getting fiery and angry. Like there's so many ways that this plays out that
Mhm.
I think of as a kind of compromise that is best honored through slowly, safely, intentionally, and with a kind of self awareness that you teach, learning to just open up a little bit more because with a little bit of vulnerability comes deeper connection
Yeah.
because we're willing to be seen. It's in being seen and received that intimacy really blossoms.
Yeah. I think there's, I love what you said. I think there's something to be said, and this is what was sort of surfacing as you were sharing, is the discernment, like coupling discernment and communication and also listening to your body. There's a lot of somatic intelligence that is present that happens even before our brain can process. And so, as we're talking about these various, as I've listened to you define intimacy, and it sounds like there's a spectrum, from the connection, from the emotional, mental connection to the physical, to the deep, even to the deeper sexual, to the deeper physical, or to the sexual and spiritual and everything in between, right? So
Yes,
there's like
yes.
all these like components to intimacy, and revealing oneself in each capacity can be scary, and maybe revealing in one capacity is not as scary as revealing in another capacity. Like being sexually intimate may be easier than being emotionally intimate or spiritually revealing oneself, right? So all of those things at play. One of the things that arises is that communicating, this is where I am in this moment with your whoever you're interacting with, the partner that you're interacting with, and then observing their response and your internal reaction to the response, to know and to discern, okay, do I feel safe enough to move forward and reveal more? Right? Do I feel safe? That seems to be a space where we can begin to be courageous. And I love that you said that. Like there's a courage that comes with revealing oneself.
Yes. And I do want to keep it real because when we talk about safety, when it comes to communication and nervous system regulation and so forth, often we mean a kind of internal ease, I'll just say.
Mhm,
And the thing about intimacy and vulnerability is that there is an edginess to it.
mhm.
So, yes, it's about feeling safe to proceed, but that doesn't mean like safe and totally at ease. Like there's
Yeah.
a spark that can, like, I think part of this journey is trial and error, if you will, to
Mhm,
like, ooh, you start to recognize, oh, that's actually not that I'm feeling unsafe. There's a little bit of turn on there
mhm,
because physiologically, like, we can feel nervous and anxious, or we can feel excitement. And the same thing is happening in our bodies. Like we have butterflies in our belly, that is like excitement, or we can feel like nauseous and we're anxious. And so there's a little bit of mindset also in what our personal safety setting is when
mhm.
it comes to revealing in an intimate context that might be different when we're navigating, let's say, a challenging relationship at work or with extended family, or I don't know what. I just wanted to introduce, like, we can be a little on edge, and that's a form of safety too when it comes to sensual, sexual, romantic intimacy.
Mhm. Yeah, no, I 100% agree with that. And I wasn't suggesting safety meant at ease, like total at ease. And I think that what there is to distinguish is, and this is why I said, listening to that
Mm,
somatic intelligence,
mm.
knowing the differences between discomfort, danger, and discomfort, excitement. Because
How
it
do
may
you
be,
distinguish them? Because I think that's such an important question.
I think that this has to be practiced before you're in the moment. And so I'll just give you personal example for me,
Great. Thank you.
which is there is a subtle in neurolinguistic programming, there's this thing called submodalities. There's a subtle difference in the way we encode so excitement and like nauseous, like, no, this is not right. Like it's almost like intuition in a way. And so when I think about something that felt uncomfortable and scary, but not like in a good way, and that turned out to be bad. And I think about that. I listen to what does that feel like in my body, and how is it different from an encounter where I felt a little nervous but excited at the same time and knew it was safe to move forward. It is a very subtle difference in encoding, but it's there. And so I think that's the thing that can, I think, sometimes get missed is that we say it encodes the same in the body, and it doesn't always, right?
Mm.
Especially for people who have that background of trauma. And I think that's a very important thing to distinguish. And it's something that perhaps a person who may be listening to this, who has that experience, needs to work with a therapist to kind of navigate that difference.
I'm really inspired by what you say because I think there is a difference, and there is the somatic wisdom in there, and that people often are in the habit of interpreting it in the unsafe way. And
Mhm.
so kind of miss the cue that actually this is kind of fun unless they slow down and put the attention on it. I really appreciate the distinction you've made. Just as people, there are people who are just in the habit of complaining, and then they need to learn the new habit of
Mhm.
gratitude and appreciation, that there's
Mhm.
something very similar. Yes, we
Yeah.
do know what feels good, but if we're not in the habit of honoring what feels good, it's easy to interpret it as anxiousness.
Yeah, and I think it's okay to honor, to go as slow as you need to go until you feel like, until you understand what that distinction is. When I think about, I've been doing some research around consent
Mhm.
and consent culture, and more from the context of more daily life.
Yes.
But one of the things that came up that I thought was very interesting is the like true consent means you can change your mind. And so it can feel good until it doesn't, and something comes up and you don't even know what it is. And then you're like, wait a second. I think that's something to be honored, because sometimes for people like myself, I can't always put a finger on what doesn't feel good and name what it is, but it doesn't feel good. And for people like us in our industry who are trained to ignore those signals and then push through all kinds of bad feelings, all kinds of discomfort that we can't even distinguish what's what, to be able to pull back and to go slow is very useful so that we can then build resilience for discomfort that's exciting and edgy, right? Without harming ourselves on the back end.
Absolutely. And I think in a way that there just is not room for all kinds of reasons in medicine and in many other careers, that in
Mhm.
our personal lives, there's usually a lot more time than we give ourselves.
Yeah.
If the car is coming and the child's running into the street, I'm not talking about that kind of situation, but 99.999% of the time in our personal lives, we can just say, okay, 1 second. I'm not sure what my response is. Give me a moment. I'm not sure how I feel about that. Hang on. And then you bring your attention inside. And when you do know, my personal experience is like it feels like something clicks in. And
Yeah.
then it's actually very easy to bring my attention back out and share in a generous way,
Mhm.
because I'm sourcing it from a truth inside me rather than overriding it. And
Yeah.
what we're taught, I just want to throw in one more thing here. I
Sure.
say
Yeah.
throw it in because
Love it.
but to me it feels connected, that one of the questions that I often get, because my I work with individuals and couples at all stages of relationship, but my primary focus really is to work with committed couples who have a life together and have been together long enough to get stuck with their patterns. And
Mm,
so I've been asked many times how to keep passion alive.
mhm,
There's the honeymoon phase, which in terms of sex can last any amount of time in a marriage. And then invariably, passion tapers off for
mm,
most people. And it's like, how do
mhm,
you make that? And so, what I share, I haven't always had a great marriage in this respect, but I have an extraordinary marriage now. And what I've come to understand is that it's not about new sex positions, it's not about like acrobatics. It's the kind of thing we're talking about where my husband and I know one another's bodies so well. And he can be inside me and make a micro adjustment, and we're both really present with ourselves and one another, and there's all this sensation that explodes, and I feel like we're in brand new territory, even though
mhm,
from the outside it looks like we're doing what we've been doing for 28 years. But
mhm,
no, with this level of attention, which is so useful for the individual in conversation, it's
mhm.
really something very similar that is the source of more sensation, more pleasure, more intimate connection. And
Mhm,
the like opening of erotic energy is to apply these very same principles,
mhm,
slowing down and reconnecting as it feels right,
mhm.
when our minds are not particularly involved. It's our bodies doing the interacting.
Yeah, I love that. I love that. I like how you just throw that extra in and then drop a big old pearl in there.
Well, you've like together we've expanded this moment of introspection that leads to
Yeah.
connection. I just wanted to be clear that applies in bed too.
Absolutely, absolutely, absolutely indeed, and I love the micro adjustment. I I get the visual of what micro would look like. It's like, that's like mindfulness, like, that's the
Yes,
epitome of
yes,
mindfulness and how mindfulness can take pleasure to the next level.
indeed.
Yes. We could really be having a conversation for the next hour because I'm like all in and loving this topic. And I feel like we've just sort of scratched the surface. I want to ask you, I definitely want to ask you if there's any, question that I haven't asked you. I want you to talk about your book. There's lots of things I want you to talk about, but I want to ask before we start to wind it down is there anything that I haven't asked you? Is there anything that you'd like to say that you haven't said to leave our audience with in terms of what to chew on after this episode is done?
Well, it has certainly been a delicious conversation that would be fun to continue to savor. But I think the one response I have to your question is that having a fantastic relationship is a learnable skill.
Mm,
So, this conversation, either as you listen, you've heard what you already experience, or you've heard something that you don't experience. And I want to be very clear, this is a learnable skill. And the main reason that most people don't have really gratifying, nourishing relationships is because they've never learned how. They
mm,
haven't learned at home, religious institutions, porn, rom coms, whatever the source may be, it's not a good source.
right.
And just know these are learnable skills if you choose to get yourself a teacher.
And that's a wonderful segue to number one, you sharing about your work that you do with couples, your book, and also how people can reach out to you if they want to work with you.
Thank you. I have All kinds of content. I have a lot of free content that people use and really transform their relationships. I have online courses, I do group programs, and I do concierge level one-on-one or one-on-two working with couples coaching. And I'm here for all of it. So you can find me at alexandrastockwell.com, where you also can download the first chapter of my book or get it, Uncompromising Intimacy. This conversation has been particularly rich and fertile, and my book covers, it's more comprehensive on the different, really, communication skills that are essential for being able to open and share in the way that I was describing with uncompromising intimacy. So if this conversation has been interesting, I highly recommend you check out my book and come listen to the Intimate Marriage podcast, where I have conversations like this every week. But all of that and my social media and so forth, you can find at alexandrastockwell.com.
Yes. And we will have all of these, you all, in the show notes. If you're watching this on YouTube, you will see this in the description. It was such a rich conversation. I fully enjoyed it. And, we may have to have another conversation to delve more into what you started at the end of the conversation.
Well, I would love that. I feel like, and I want to call listeners' attention to this, that this conversation was an example of what we're talking about. You and I are obviously not intimate in many different regards. We've never even met in person, but the way this conversation has meandered, and I could feel you check in with yourself and then ask a question, and I've checked in with myself before giving an answer. And so I'm just really happy that we've embodied what we're articulating.
Yes, yes. It's, to live what we teach, or always say, teach what we live, what we preach.
Yes, yes, exactly,
Right,
exactly.
exactly. Well, thank you again, Dr. Alexandra, for being on the show. I so appreciate you. I so appreciate just being in community with you, even outside of this podcast and outside of these rooms. And so you heard her. You need to go and you need to listen to tell me the name of the podcast again.
The Intimate Marriage Podcast.
The Intimate Marriage Podcast. Go to the Intimate Marriage Podcast and visit Dr. Alexandra at alexandrastockwell.com. Like I said, we will have all of her social media and podcasts and website in the show notes. And I'd like for you to share this episode, because we all need a little uncompromising intimacy in our lives. So share this episode, share it with a friend, a family member, a colleague, and let people know how important uncompromising intimacy is. And finally, don't forget to leave a review, because we want people to know, who are coming behind you, the kind of difference that we're making with these conversations. And finally, don't forget to subscribe so you know when the next podcast is coming up. So with that, I leave you. Again, thank you, Dr. Alexandra. And to my audience, thank you for listening. Until we see you again, stay empowered. Thank you for listening to our podcast. We know that without the listeners, there is no podcast. We hope you enjoyed this episode. Please remember to subscribe so you do not miss when we drop our next episode. And share this podcast with a friend, a family member, and a colleague, at least one person in your life today. This episode was brought to you by the Mind Remapping Company, helping organizations create psychologically and emotionally safe cultures that make their employees and leaders feel seen, heard, respected, welcome, and valued, all while fostering a thriving, engaged, and healthy workforce for the organization. Is your organization in need of a speaker? I speak about topics like psychological and emotional safety, trauma-informed communication, and employee well-being. If this is aligned with your organizational inclusion, belonging, or leadership goals, contact me, Dr. Maisha, by going to www.mindremappingacademy.com. That's mindremappingacademy.com. Finally, we train leaders, but we also train coaches. If you're interested in becoming a trauma-informed coach. Visit our website as well and check out our NLP coach trainings and certifications. We'll see you on the next episode. Until then, stay empowered.